A very warm welcome to the channel. I hope you all are doing very well. Today's story is about a murder case, which is the biggest unsolved case in Germany's history till date, and its mystery remains unsolved even today. This is a tale of such a murder that the deeper you delve into it, the more complex it becomes. But the question surrounding this case is not just about how the family died, but also about the strange, mysterious, and frightening events that occurred. So what exactly happened in this case? What transpired? And what is the full story? Let's start from the beginning. Bavaria is the capital region. About 70 kilometers from this region lies a small village named Groben. This story takes place in the year 1921. In 1921, about 500 meters outside the village, there was a farmhouse named Hinterkaifeck. This farmhouse was surrounded by dense forests on three sides, with only one side open towards Groben village. Besides this, it was the only farmhouse in the area because there were no other houses within a 500-meter radius. A farmer's family used to live in this farmhouse, consisting of the head of the family, 63-year-old Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia Gruber, aged 72, their 35-year-old daughter Victoria Gabriel, who was a widow, and Victoria's two children, a 7-year-old daughter Cecilia, and a 2.5-year-old son Joseph. There was also a maid, 24-year-old Crescens Rieger, who lived with them. So altogether there were 6 people living in that farmhouse: the couple, their widowed daughter, her 2 children, and a maid. The family was quite wealthy, owning several fields, barns, buffaloes, horses, and other domestic animals, meaning they lacked nothing. However, Andreas often had quarrels, and in his anger, would sometimes even physically assault his wife and children. Therefore, the villagers did not like Andreas and kept their distance from him. There was another reason why the villagers disliked Andreas, but I will tell you about that later in the story. Andreas did not care whether the villagers liked him or not, and he only interacted with them as much as was necessary. Everything in the family was going smoothly until now. But then one night, something happened that changed everything. What happened was that one night, when everyone in the house was asleep, the maid, Crescens Rieger, suddenly felt that someone was in the attic of the farmhouse because she could hear footsteps. The attic is actually an upper part of the house, and since most of the houses back then were hut-like structures, attics were common. People usually stored old or seldom used items there. When the maid heard the footsteps in the attic for the first time, she ignored them. But after a while, she felt someone walking in the attic again, and this time she got scared. She got up from her room and woke up Andreas Gruber to tell him about it. After hearing the maid's story, Andreas went up to the attic to check. He didn't find anyone there. The attic was not very cluttered, so there was no place for anyone to hide. Andreas came down and reassured the maid that no one was there and that it was just her imagination, urging her to go back to sleep. After hearing this, the maid went back to her room, but she couldn't sleep all night due to fear. For the next few days, everything remained normal. But then, one day when Andreas and his entire family were working in the fields and the maid was alone at home, she again heard footsteps coming from the attic. After a while, she felt someone was walking in another room in the house, which terrified her. When Andreas returned home, she told him everything. Andreas checked the entire attic again, but found no one. However, this phenomenon started occurring more frequently. Whenever the maid was alone in the house, especially at night, she always felt that someone else was in the house and that something was watching her, making her so scared that she couldn't sleep at all. Despite searching the entire farmhouse many times, Andreas never found anyone, leading the maid to believe that the house was haunted by ghosts or spirits. So she decided to leave her job. At the end of 1921, Crescens Rieger left the Hinterkaifeck farm. So now Andreas and his family began searching for another maid. But by then, word had spread throughout the village and the surrounding area that the Hinterkaifeck farmhouse was haunted. When some people asked Crescence why she had left her job, she shared everything she had heard and felt in the farmhouse. You know how quickly such stories spread in a village. So Andreas Gruber had a hard time finding another maid, as no one was willing to work in the supposedly haunted and isolated farmhouse. When some people asked Andreas about it, he got angry and insisted that it was all nonsense and that there were no ghosts in his farmhouse. Despite his frustration, Andreas still couldn't find a maid to work in his house. One night, while Andreas and his entire family were sleeping, he suddenly woke up to the sound of footsteps. Again, he heard the sound of footsteps, but this time he couldn't find anyone. He couldn't understand how, if someone had been in the attic, they could disappear so suddenly when there was no place to hide. The night passed, and the next day came. But as the days went by, stranger things started happening in the farmhouse. Household items began to move on their own. Andreas noticed that tools and equipment he had placed in one spot were now in different locations, even though no one was home at the time. Additionally, when Andreas and his family returned from working in the fields, they often found their cattle and horses grazing outside, even though they had left the animals securely in the barn. These occurrences baffled Andreas, and he couldn't understand who was releasing the animals while the entire family was away. Days went by, and March arrived. One day, Andreas noticed a newspaper lying around. When he picked it up, he was shocked. It was a Munich newspaper, from a city about 70 kilometers away from his farmhouse. He thought perhaps a family member had brought it. But when he asked his wife and daughter, they both denied bringing the newspaper. Andreas then thought that maybe the newspaper delivery person had mistakenly delivered it to his house. But when he asked the newspaper delivery person the next day, he said that he didn't deliver that particular newspaper, and no one in the entire village subscribed to it. This puzzled Andreas even more, as he couldn't understand what was going on in his house. A few days later, the main door key of the house went missing. When Andreas asked his family about it, they all denied touching the key, and even swore they hadn't moved it. Andreas's family knew his temper well, so they wouldn't dare lie to him. Then, in that same month of March, something even stranger happened. When Andreas Gruber woke up and went outside, he discovered that it had snowed the previous night. As he walked toward the machine room of the farmhouse, he saw fresh footprints in the snow leading from the nearby forest to the machine room. The lock on the machine room door was also broken. He checked around the house but found no footprints leading away from the house. This convinced him that whoever had entered the farmhouse the previous night was still inside. Andreas began searching the entire farmhouse, but despite thoroughly inspecting every room and corner, he found no one. He became increasingly fearful, suspecting that someone might indeed be hiding in the house. The strange thing was that the farmhouse had a very fierce dog that would bark at any stranger approaching the house. However, for the past 6 months, despite all the odd occurrences, the dog had never barked at anyone, not even the previous night. The next day, Andreas told his neighbors, Lorenz Schlittenbauer and Jacob Siegel, about the footprints in the snow. Their houses were about 500 meters away in the nearby village of Gröbern. After hearing this, both neighbors suspected that it might be the work of a thief or a prankster. Lorenz offered Andreas his gun for safety, but for some reason, Andreas didn't take it. In hindsight, it might have been better for his safety if he had accepted the gun. The date was March 31st, 1922, and it was the first time in almost 6 months that the family had a reason to be happy, because their new maid was arriving that day. They had been searching for a maid for almost 6 months and had struggled to manage the household without one. The new maid's name was Maria Baumgartner, and she was about 44 years old. Maria didn't care whether the farmhouse was haunted or not, or about the strange happenings of the past 6 months. She just needed a job, having been unemployed for the past 2 months and living with her sister. Not wanting to burden her sister any longer, Maria accepted the job at Hinterkaifeck. Given her age and experience, she probably believed that stories of ghosts and spirits were just hearsay. On the evening of Friday, March 31st, 1922, around 5 p.m., Maria arrived at the farmhouse with her sister Franziska. Despite people being present in the house, Franziska felt an eerie stillness. After meeting everyone, Franziska stayed for about an hour and left around 6 p.m., leaving Maria at the farmhouse. Now, the farmhouse had 6 occupants: Andreas, his wife, their daughter, her 2 children, and the new maid Maria. The night of March 31st, 1922 passed, and the next day, Saturday, April 1st, 1922, arrived. On this day, 2 brothers, Hans Shiroski and Eduard Shiroski, who sold coffee, visited Hinterkaifeck farm around noon. Andreas Gruber had asked them to come a few days earlier to buy some coffee. However, when the brothers arrived, they found no one at the farm. They knocked on the farmhouse door several times, but no one answered. They then circled the farmhouse, checking every door and window, but all were locked from the inside, except for the door to the machine room, where they stored the grain-cutting machine and other tools. Even in the machine room, they found no one, though they could hear the sounds of animals and a dog from inside the farmhouse. After searching for a while, the brothers left, unable to find anyone. Later that evening, around 5 p.m., 2 hunters passing by the farmhouse on their way to the forest thought of stopping by to get some provisions. They too found the farmhouse deserted, and after knocking on the door with no response, they left without buying anything. Around 11:30 p.m. that night, a neighbor named Michael Plockel was on his way home. His route passed near Hinterkaifeck farm. He noticed that the kitchen light was on, which seemed unusual because the family usually finished their work and went to bed early. He wondered if someone was finishing up a task or preparing for the next day, but as he approached, he noticed smoke coming from the kitchen chimney and sensed something was wrong. He decided to investigate. As he got closer to the farmhouse, he saw a figure in the darkness. The person's face was obscured, and they were holding a torch, which they pointed directly at Michael, making it difficult for him to see the person's face. He called out, asking if everything was all right, but received no response. The figure started moving towards him slowly. When the figure got closer, Michael saw that the person was holding a weapon in the other hand, which frightened him, and he ran back home. The next day, April 2nd, 1922, was a Sunday. As usual, early in the morning, 2 women came to pick up Andreas's daughter, Victoria Gabriel, to take her to church. Victoria regularly sang in the church choir with other women and girls every Sunday. Usually she waited for them outside her house, but that morning she was not there. The women waited for a while, but when no one came out of the farmhouse, they assumed that Victoria had either gone to church early or would come later with her family. So they went to church without her. When they arrived at the church, they found that Victoria was not there either. Even after the service ended, there was no sign of Andreas Gruber or his family, which was very unusual because the family was known to be very religious and never missed church. Then, in the afternoon of that day, a neighbor's son went to Hinterkaifeck farm to buy lard. Lard is made from pig fat. When he arrived at the farmhouse, he too found no one there. After knocking on the door and receiving no answer, he noticed that the farm animals were eating their hay and fodder in the barn, and some were grazing in the open field. He thought the family might be working in the fields, so he left. The next day, Monday, April 3rd, 1922, the postman, Joseph Meyer, who usually delivered newspapers to the farmhouse, arrived in the morning and saw that the newspaper he had delivered on Saturday was still lying there, untouched. He thought the family might have gone out, but when he peeked through the kitchen window, he saw half-eaten food inside and smelled freshly cooked food, as if someone had just cooked. He waited for a while, hoping someone would come out, but when no one did, he left. No one in the village had seen any member of the family. However, the villagers did notice smoke coming from the farmhouse chimney several times, so they didn't suspect anything unusual and didn't think much about it. The next day, Tuesday, April 4th, 1922, around 9 a.m., a mechanic named Albert arrived at Hinterkaifeck farm to repair a machine. Andreas Gruber had called him days earlier to fix a broken machine. Albert also found no one at the farmhouse, and all the windows and doors were locked. The animals were inside the barn. He waited for a while, hoping someone would come, but when no one did, he went to the machine room and found the door open. The machine he had come to repair was inside, so he started working on it. He worked on the machine for about 4.5 hours, testing it several times, which caused a lot of noise. Despite the noise, no one came to see him during this time. Around 1:30 p.m., after finishing his work, he came out of the room and noticed the dog tied up outside. He thought the family must have returned because the dog couldn't have tied itself up. However, the main door of the house was still locked. He went around to the back of the house and saw that the barn door, which had previously been closed, was now open. He called out for Andreas and knocked on the door, but received no response. Since he had other work to attend to and was running late, he left but shared what he had seen at the farmhouse with some villagers in Grobern. Among them was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who realized that he had not seen any member of the Hinterkaifeck household for the past few days. Additionally, when his son returned from school, he mentioned that Victoria Gabriel, who was in the same class, had not attended school for the past 4 days, which was unusual for her because she was a diligent student. Hearing this, Lorenz sent his 2 sons to Hinterkaifeck farm around 3:30 p.m. to check if everything was all right. They also found no one there. However, this time they noticed that the dog was tied up again in the barn and barking from inside. When Lorenz shared this information with his neighbor, Jacob Siegel, Jacob mentioned that his son had also gone to Hinterkaifeck farm a couple of days ago to buy lard, but found no one there, and no one answered the door. Realizing something was definitely wrong, they decided to go to the farm themselves to investigate. Around 5 p.m., they arrived at the farmhouse and saw that no one was around. They noticed that newspapers from the past 3 days were still lying around, untouched. They went to the back of the farmhouse where the barn was and found the barn door open. The 3 of them entered the barn, but it was almost dark outside, making it difficult to see inside the dimly lit barn. The first room they entered in the barn had animal feed like hay and fodder. The animals were in the next room. As soon as Lorenz stepped into the first room, he stumbled over something in the dark. Initially, he didn't pay much attention and continued towards the animals. Michael Pohl also stumbled in the dark but managed to keep his balance. When he looked closely to see what he had stumbled over, he saw a human leg sticking out from the hay. Terrified, he called the others, and Lorenz uncovered the hay to reveal the body of Andreas Gruber. Lorenz moved further and found another body, that of Andreas Gruber's wife. All 4 bodies were piled on top of each other, with their heads brutally smashed, and blood was splattered all over the floor. They checked the bodies to see if anyone was still alive, but sadly, everyone was dead. Lorenz and Michael then went to the main farmhouse door, and Lorenz entered through the barn into the main area of the house where the bedrooms were. He opened the main door from the inside, allowing Jacob and Michael to enter. When they reached Victoria Gabriel's room, they found the 5th body, that of her 2.5-year-old son, Joseph, dead in his cot with his head smashed. Thinking that the new maid might be behind all this, they checked the rest of the house. In the servants' room next to the kitchen, they saw a leg sticking out from under a blanket. When they uncovered it, they found the bloodied body of the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, the sixth and final victim, with her head also smashed. Shocked by the sight of the 6 bodies, they sent Lorenz's son to inform the police and the mayor about the gruesome discovery. Along with Lorenz and the others, there was also Lorenz's son who had stayed outside during this time. Lorenz's son immediately took a ride on a passing man's bicycle to go inform the police and the mayor about the news. Along the way, he told everyone he met about the murders. The news quickly spread throughout the village because 6 murders in a small village was a huge event. A crowd gathered at the farmhouse, and anyone who saw the scene was deeply shaken. Shortly after, the police and the mayor arrived at the farmhouse. Upon seeing the 6 bodies, the mayor and the 2 policemen were shocked. The news then reached higher authorities, causing a stir throughout the police department as word of the 6 murders spread. The farmhouse quickly turned into a major crime scene with a flood of police officers arriving. By around midnight, Detective Georg Reingruber from the Munich Police Department arrived to take charge of the investigation. All 6 bodies were moved for autopsies, and Detective Reingruber began his investigation. However, he found no scientific evidence because, before the police arrived, people had freely roamed the entire farmhouse, moving the bodies and examining everything, thus contaminating the crime scene. While the crime scene was now compromised, Detective Reingruber noticed a few things. The farm animals had been fed on time. Milk had been freshly drawn from the cows. Fresh food had been cooked in the kitchen, and the pantry was nearly empty, indicating that the murders hadn't happened long ago. However, without more concrete evidence from the house, he waited for the autopsy results, hoping they would provide some clues. The next day, the news spread from Munich to all over Germany, appearing on the front pages of every newspaper. People were shocked, and discussions about the Hinterkaifeck murders dominated conversations across Germany, alongside talks of Adolf Hitler. In that era, the brutal murder of an entire family in one night was a significant event. 2 days after the murders, on April 6, 1922, the autopsies of all 6 victims were conducted at the farmhouse. However, the findings from the autopsies only complicated the case further, which I will discuss in the second part of this story. That's all for the first part of this story. I will upload second part on next week. So, if you like this video, subscribe now. You can also comment your thoughts about this story. I will see you in the second part of this story. Until then, take care. Thank you very much.